Hey friends, tonight we step back in time, not to the age of castles and kings you see in movies, but into the muddy boots and empty stomachs of real medieval life. This was a world without supermarkets, without fridges, without even the idea of fast food. A time where getting dinner meant growing it, catching it, or sometimes just hoping for the best. You might know medieval Europe for knights, castles, and royal feasts. But behind those shining moments was a much harsher truth. For most people, food was not a choice. It was a daily battle, just to stay alive, and the next meal was never guaranteed. So, before we get into the thick of it, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of deep dive into history. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing our little global village come together for nights like this. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and maybe imagine the smell of wood smoke and boiling barley porridge in the air. This is not just a story about food. It is about how people survived when survival was never easy. Imagine waking up in a world where there are no supermarkets, no corner shops, no refrigerators, no packaged snacks, no restaurants, just you, your family, your village, and the land. This was not fiction or a post-apocalyptic movie. This was a real life for people living in medieval Europe. Food was not something people simply bought. It was something they had to grow, find, catch, or trade for. Eating was not about choice or taste. It was about survival. Every meal was the result of hard work, planning, and often a little bit of luck. Most people in medieval Europe were peasants. These were farmers who worked the land, usually not their own land, but land that belonged to a noble or a lord. In return, they paid rent or shared their harvest. They had to grow enough food to feed their families and still give a share to the landowners. This left very little room for mistakes. A bad harvest could mean hunger or even death. The idea of having a fully stocked kitchen with shelves full of options was unheard of. In fact, most people ate the same food every day. Variety was rare. Meat was not eaten often by the poor. It was expensive and saved for special occasions. Vegetables, grains, and whatever wild food could be found made up most of the meals. Seasons controlled everything. If it was not the right time of year, then some foods were simply not available. Winter was the hardest time. People had to rely on stored food, dried goods, or preserved items. If their storage ran out, there was no shop to go to. They just had to make do or go hungry. There were no fancy diets, no gluten-free, no vegan plans, and certainly no superfoods as we know them today. People ate what they could grow or find. Food was mostly about staying alive and keeping enough strength to work. Life was deeply connected to the rhythm of nature. People had to understand the soil, the weather, and the seasons better than most of us do today. A sudden frost could destroy a whole crop. Heavy rain could ruin the harvest. Drought could mean starvation. There were no backup plans. Even with all this, people found ways to survive. They learned which plants were good to eat. They knew how to store grains and dry fruits. They knew how to ferment vegetables and smoke meat. These skills were passed down from one generation to the next. Hunger was a common part of life. Famines were not rare. There were times when entire regions had no food. Diseases would spread quickly when people were weak from hunger. Life was hard, and food was always a central part of the struggle. Many peasants worked from sunrise to sunset. They ate quickly and returned to their tasks. Meals were often simple, made with grains like barley or oats, and cooked into thick porridge or bread. If they were lucky, they added a few vegetables or some wild herbs for flavor. Most food was cooked in one pot, shared by the whole family. Fresh fruits and vegetables were only available in their season. There were no tomatoes, no potatoes, and no chocolate. These foods came much later from other parts of the world. Instead, they had things like cabbage, onions, garlic, and wild berries. Apples and plums were common in some regions and often dried for winter. Drinks were also limited. Clean water was not always available, especially in crowded villages. People drank weak beer or ale, which was safer than dirty water. Even children drank it. Wine was available in some areas, but mostly for the rich. Food waste was not a concept in those times. Every part of an animal, plant, or grain was used. Bones were boiled into broth. Old bread became soup thickener. Even scraps were saved for animals. People had to be creative and careful. Cooking tools were few. A large pot, a wooden spoon, and a fire were enough for most meals. Ovens were rare in peasant homes, so bread was often baked in communal village ovens. Firewood was precious, and meals were cooked to save fuel. Celebrations were some of the few times when food became abundant. Weddings, harvest festivals, and religious holidays allowed people to enjoy better meals, sometimes with meat, dairy, and sweet treats. But these were rare and looked forward to all year. While the nobles dined on fine meats, pastries, and imported goods, peasants lived on the edge of survival. The difference between rich and poor was most visible in what they ate. Yet the peasants' knowledge of the land, plants, and natural methods helped them endure. Today, we throw away leftovers without a second thought. In medieval times, a spoiled sack of grain could mean hunger for a whole family. The idea of wasting food was unthinkable. Many of us go to the store when we need something. In medieval life, if something was missing, you did not have it. You had to find a replacement, trade with a neighbor, or go without. This was not just a harder life. It was a different way of thinking. Food was not a product. It was life. It was health. It was community. And it was always uncertain. In many ways, people were more connected to their food than we are today. They knew where it came from. They respected the effort it took to grow. They did not take it for granted. Understanding medieval eating is not just about history. It helps us see how far we have come and maybe how much we have lost in our relationship with food. It shows us what people are capable of when they have no choice but to survive. As we explore the different parts of this story, we will see the many clever and surprising ways medieval people fed themselves. It was a life full of challenges, but also full of lessons about food, resilience, and the power of human adaptation. In the medieval world, people did not decide what to eat. The weather and the seasons made those choices for them. There were no greenhouses, no imports from other countries, and no frozen meals. Food was local, and it came when nature allowed it. Each season brought its own joys, struggles, and foods. Spring was a time of hope, but also of hunger. People were often at their weakest after the long winter. Their storage was running low, and nothing fresh was ready yet. They had to survive on whatever was left from the previous year. This often meant dry bread, old beans, and root vegetables. These foods were stored underground or in cellars, but by spring, much of it was spoiled or close to it. Fresh greens were the first sign that winter was truly over. Plants like nettles, dandelions, and wild herbs began to grow. People picked them to make soups and stews. These plants were not only free, but also packed with vitamins. After months of dried food, these greens helped fight weakness and illness. This was the body's way of saying thank you to nature. Summer was the most generous season. Gardens came alive. Peas, onions, carrots, and cabbages began to grow. Fruits like cherries, berries, and early apples ripened under the sun. This was a busy time. People worked hard in the fields, but they also ate better. Meals were more colorful and fresh. It was also the time to start preparing for the harder months ahead. People dried fruit and herbs in the sun. They smoked fish and meat. They gathered honey and stored it in jars. They salted vegetables and began filling barrels with pickles or sauerkraut. Summer was not just for eating well. It was for building the food wall that would protect them from hunger in the cold seasons. Autumn was the season of the harvest. It was both joyful and stressful. Families collected everything they could. Grain was harvested and stored in large sacks or barrels. Turnips and onions were pulled from the soil. Nuts were picked from trees. Grapes were turned into wine or vinegar. Apples were dried or pressed into juice or cider. It was a race against time and weather. A good harvest meant a better chance of surviving the winter. A poor harvest meant tough choices. Would the family eat now and risk starving later? Or save more and go hungry now to make the food last? Autumn was also the time to slaughter animals. Keeping livestock through winter was expensive and difficult. Most animals were killed and preserved in some way. Their meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Nothing was wasted. Blood was turned into pudding. Fat was used for cooking. Bones were boiled for soup. Even intestines became sausage casings. Winter was the most feared season. Cold, snow, and short days made farming impossible. Nothing grew. Food had to come from storage. People ate whatever they had saved. Barley bread, dried beans, smoked meat, and preserved vegetables. Meals were simple and repeated day after day. Firewood was as precious as food. Cooking had to be done carefully to avoid wasting fuel. People often made one-pot meals, throwing in everything they had into a thick stew. These meals were not exciting, but they were warm and filling. In winter, many people ate less. It was not always by choice. Some simply ran out of food. Others stretched their supplies by eating smaller portions. Hunger was common, especially among the poor. Diseases also spread more in winter, when people were weak and stayed indoors. Still, people found comfort in routine. They knew what to expect from each season. They planned for it. They respected it. They were part of nature's cycle, not above it. There were no bananas in winter. No strawberries in spring unless you picked them yourself. No tomatoes at all. These came centuries later from faraway lands. What people ate came from their soil, their forests, their rivers. Even the church calendar was tied to food. There were fasting periods when people could not eat meat or dairy. These rules added another layer to seasonal eating. People became experts at cooking without animal products. This led to many creative dishes using grains, legumes, and vegetables. Seasons also affected trade. In summer and autumn, markets were full. Farmers came with fresh goods, but in winter, Many roads were blocked, trade slowed down, villages had to rely on what they already had. Children learned early how to help with food. They picked berries, dug up roots, and carried water. They watched their parents preserve food. This knowledge was passed down because forgetting how to store food could mean death. Today, we can eat strawberries in December and frozen pizza in minutes. But in the medieval world, eating was about patience. It was about timing. You had to eat what was in front of you, or wait until nature allowed it. There was beauty in that too. People looked forward to the first apples, or the first mushrooms after rain. A ripe plum tasted better because you had waited a whole year for it. The food was not just about taste, it was about the story behind it. Modern life gives us choice. Medieval life gave people understanding. They knew which plants healed, which ones filled the belly, and which ones to avoid. They did not need labels. Their knowledge came from generations of watching, tasting, and trusting the land. Seasons were not just times of year. They were the rulers of daily life. They told you when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest, and when to pray. In many ways, the seasons were the true kings and queens of the medieval world. And so, in the world before supermarkets, the real menu was written by the sun, the rain, the soil, and the cycle of life. In the modern world, most of us do not worry about keeping food fresh. We have refrigerators, freezers, and canned goods. But in medieval times, food could spoil in just a few days if it was not handled the right way. People had to be clever to make their food last through the seasons, especially during the long winters. Without modern machines, medieval families used simple but smart methods to keep food from going bad. These methods came from hundreds of years of trial and error. Every village had its own secrets and tricks, passed down through generations. One of the most common methods was drying. Drying removed the water from food so bacteria could not grow. Fruits like apples, plums, and berries were sliced and left in the sun or by the fire to dry. These dried fruits could last for months and were often eaten in winter. They were also used in stews and desserts during special events. Grains like oats, barley, and rye were harvested, dried, and stored in the sacks or wooden bins. These grains were a main part of the diet, so people made sure to keep them safe from moisture and pests. If even a little water got into the storage bin, mold could ruin everything. Another popular method was salting. Salt was very important in medieval kitchens, not just for flavor, but also for survival. Meat and fish were rubbed with lots of salt and packed into barrels. The salt pulled out the moisture and stopped bacteria from growing. This preserved meat could last for many weeks or even months. Smoking was used in many regions too. People hung meat or fish above a slow fire, letting the smoke dry and flavor it at the same time. This method worked well in cooler areas where the air was not too humid. Smoked meat often had a strong taste, but it stayed edible far longer than fresh meat. Vegetables were often fermented. People chopped up cabbage and packed it tightly into jars or barrels with salt. Over time, natural bacteria turned it into something like sauerkraut. This sour vegetable mix was full of vitamins and lasted for months. It was also good for digestion. Pickling was another way to keep vegetables from spoiling. People used vinegar, salt water, or even fermented whey to preserve cucumbers, onions, and other garden foods. These pickles added flavor to simple meals. and helped people get nutrients when fresh food was not available. Medieval people also knew how to use cool, dark places to their advantage. They dug cellars under their homes or used caves to keep food cold. These spaces stayed at a steady temperature all year, which helped slow down the spoiling process. Root vegetables, like turnips, carrots, and beets, were stored in these places, sometimes packed in sand to keep them fresh longer. Clay pots and jars were used to store oil, honey, grains, and dried fruits. Some were sealed with wax or cloth to keep out air and bugs. People also used wooden barrels, leather bags, and woven baskets. They had to be very careful because even a small tear or hole could let in mice, insects, or moisture. Milk was difficult to store for long, so it was often turned into cheese or butter right away. Cheese could be aged and stored for months, and butter was kept in cool areas or salted to last longer. These products gave people a way to enjoy dairy long after the cow had stopped producing milk for the season. Even bread was made to last, while soft bread did not stay fresh for long. Hard, dense loaves could last for weeks. People often baked large batches and stored them in cool, dry places. When the bread became too hard to chew, they soaked it in broth or milk to soften it. Eggs were another food that spoiled quickly. In some areas, people preserved them in ash, lime water, or even salt. These methods were not perfect, but they helped stretch the supply when chickens stopped laying in the winter months. One very important part of food storage was keeping out pests. Rats, mice, and insects were always a threat. People used cats to catch rodents and often hung food from the ceiling to keep it out of reach. Herbs with strong smells, like mint or lavender, were placed near storage areas to drive away bugs. There were no food safety labels or expiration dates. People learned to use their senses. They smelled the food, looked for mold, and knew when something was too risky to eat. Sometimes this meant taking chances. If food was low, even slightly spoiled food might still be eaten. What made all of this work was planning. People had to think months ahead. They had to know how much food they would need for the winter. They had to choose what to eat now and what to save. There were no late-night trips to the store. Once the food was gone, that was it. This is why food was treated with such respect. People did not waste it. They used every part of it. Bones were boiled into soup, fruit skins were fed to animals, and even the fat from meat was saved for cooking or making candles. Food was not just fuel, it was life, and every bite mattered. Families worked together to prepare and store food. Children learned from a young age how to help with drying fruit, packing grains, or stirring the pickle jars. Food storage was a community effort. People helped each other, traded goods, and shared tools. If one family had extra plums and another had extra onions, they traded. This kept everyone fed. Storage was not just about food. It was about survival. Without the right methods, a good harvest could be wasted. And without good storage, a family could go hungry even if the fields had been full. Today, we have machines, electricity, and global trade to make food storage easy. But the cleverness of medieval people shows that even without all of that, it was still possible to eat well if you planned, worked hard, and respected what the land gave you. They had no supermarkets, but they had knowledge, and that knowledge, more than anything, kept them alive. In the medieval world, eating was not only about staying alive, It was also about sharing. Meals were a social experience. People gathered together to eat, talk, and rest. Even when food was simple or scarce, the act of eating brought people closer. Most peasants lived in small villages, often just a few dozen families. Their homes were close together, and their lives were deeply connected. They worked together in the fields, helped each other build houses, and gathered for celebrations. Food was at the center of all of this. Inside a peasant home, meals were eaten around a simple table, or sometimes just near the fire. Furniture was basic. A wooden bench or a few stools were enough. Plates were often made of wood or thick bread, and spoons were shared. Knives were personal, and each person usually carried their own. There were no forks, as they were not common in Europe until much later. People used their hands or simple tools. Hygiene was not like today, but they did their best. Hands were washed with water from a jug before meals, especially in larger gatherings. The main cooking pot was one of the most important things in the house. It stayed over the fire, and food was cooked slowly throughout the day. Stews, soups, and porridge were common. These meals could be stretched easily and were shared by the whole family. Most meals were eaten in silence or with quiet conversation. But on special days, like holidays or harvest festivals, meals became lively and joyful. Singing, dancing, and storytelling often followed the meal. These gatherings helped people feel connected, even during hard times. Food also played a role in church life. Villagers gathered after religious services for shared meals. On feast days, the whole community might join in one big meal, often held outdoors in good weather. These were times when people ate better, sometimes with meat, bread, and sweet dishes. Weddings were another time when food became a celebration. Families prepared for weeks. Neighbors helped cook and brought ingredients. A wedding feast could last an entire day and was often the biggest meal of the year. Everyone in the village was invited, and even the poor were given something to eat. When someone died, food was again part of the gathering. After the burial, people came together to support the family with a shared meal. It was a way to remember, mourn, and also take care of those left behind. Trade and food sharing were part of everyday village life. If one family had a good crop of onions and another had eggs, they might trade. No money was needed. This barter system helped everyone get what they needed. It also built trust and cooperation. Food brought people together during hard times too. If a family lost their crops to a storm, neighbors might bring bread or dried beans. Sharing food in these moments was not just kind, it helped the whole village survive. Children learned these habits early. They helped with meals, gathered herbs, and carried food to neighbors. They learned not to waste and to give when someone was in need. These lessons were part of growing up. Hospitality was a strong value in many medieval communities. If a traveler came to a village, it was common to offer them food and shelter. Even poor families would share what little they had. It was seen as a duty and a blessing to feed the hungry. In castles and noble homes, meals were larger and more formal. Long tables were filled with dishes, servants poured wine, and music was played. But even there, the idea of sharing remained important. Guests were treated with respect, and food was used to show wealth and generosity. But the biggest difference between rich and poor was the variety of food. While peasants had bread, grains, and vegetables most days. The rich enjoyed meat, spices, and imported goods. Still, the act of eating together, no matter the menu, brought people closer. In some places, villages had shared ovens. Not every home had one, so people took turns baking their bread in a large, communal oven. This was a chance to talk, laugh, and share news while waiting for the bread to bake. Sometimes, large pots of food were made by groups of families. This was done during celebrations or during times of hardship, like after a fire or flood. It made cooking easier and ensured everyone got something warm to eat. Even the smallest bits of food had a place in the community. Leftover bread might be given to animals or boiled into a thick soup. Bones from one family's meal might be borrowed by another family to make broth. Nothing was wasted. Stories and songs were often shared around the fire after a meal. Elders told tales, and children listened. This was how knowledge and culture were passed on. It helped people feel safe, even if life was hard. Meals were not just about food, they were about love, support, and togetherness. In a world full of danger, sickness, and hunger, sharing a warm meal with others gave people strength. It reminded them they were not alone. Today, we eat alone in front of screens or rush through meals in cars. In the medieval world, food was slow, shared, and meaningful. It was a daily reminder of human connection. Even when the table was bare, the act of sitting together gave people hope. A simple bowl of stew, passed from one hand to another, could carry more comfort than a feast. Food built relationships. It kept villages strong. It helped people survive not only with their bodies, but also with their hearts. In the quiet glow of the fire, with a spoon in hand and family nearby, medieval people found moments of peace in a hard world. Before there were supermarkets, or even proper markets in every town, many people in medieval Europe had to look to nature to fill their plates. The fields, forests, rivers, and meadows were full of wild foods, if you knew where to look. Foraging was not a hobby back then. It was a necessary part of staying alive. People learned how to find food in the wild from a young age. Parents taught children how to tell the difference between safe and dangerous plants. This knowledge was passed down like family treasure. Getting it wrong could mean sickness or even death, so people took it seriously. One of the most common wild foods was berries. Strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, and elderberries grew in the woods and along hedges. In summer, families would go out and collect them in baskets. These berries were eaten fresh or dried for later. They added sweetness to a simple diet and were packed with vitamins. Mushrooms were another gift from the forest, but they came with risk. Some mushrooms are delicious, while others are deadly. Only experienced foragers picked them, and people had their favorite spots where mushrooms always seemed to grow. Mushrooms were usually added to soups and stews to make them richer and more filling. Wild nuts were also collected in autumn. Hazelnuts, walnuts, and chestnuts were common in different parts of Europe. They were eaten raw, roasted, or ground into paste or flour. Nuts were a good source of energy and healthy fats, something that was hard to find in the diets of poor families. Greens like dandelion leaves, sorrel, and nettles were picked in spring and early summer. These plants grew almost everywhere and were some of the first fresh foods available after winter. They were used in soups, teas, or simply boiled and eaten as a side dish. Some of these plants helped clean the body after months of dried and heavy food. People also gathered roots and tubers from the ground. Wild carrots, parsnips, and garlic were known in some areas. These were used in cooking or for medicine. People knew which plants to dig up and when the best time was to do it. One of the most important wild resources was herbs. These were not just used for flavor, they were also used for health. Herbs like mint, thyme, sage, and rosemary were known to help with colds, stomach pain, or infections. Women who were skilled in herbs were highly respected in villages. They knew how to make teas, pastes, and healing mixes. Honey was gathered from wild bees when people could find a hive. This was a dangerous job, but the reward was worth it. Honey was one of the only sweeteners available. It was also used to treat wounds and coughs. People believed honey had magical or healing powers, and in many ways, they were right. Fishing was another way to get food from nature. Rivers, lakes, and even ponds were full of fish like trout, perch, and pike. People used simple tools like nets, spears, or traps made from woven sticks. Even children knew how to catch fish with a hook tied to a string. Fishing was not always allowed everywhere. In many places, the local lord owned the best rivers, but people still fished at night or in hidden spots. It was worth the risk. A fish could feed a family, and any extra could be dried or smoked for later. In coastal areas, people gathered shellfish and seaweed. Mussels, clams, and oysters were free for the taking during low tide. Seaweed was used in soups or fed to animals. These foods were especially important during poor harvests when there was little to eat on land. Birds' eggs were collected in the spring from wild nests. People climbed trees or searched bushes for eggs from ducks, gulls, or other birds. This was a risky job, especially for children, but eggs were valuable. They were eaten fresh or cooked into flat cakes and thick soups. Insects were not a big part of the diet in most parts of Europe, but beetles, grubs, and even ants were sometimes eaten during times of hunger. It might sound strange today, but when food was low, people tried everything they could find. Foraging helped balance the diet. While grains filled the stomach, wild plants and animals brought in vitamins, minerals, and flavors that were hard to get from simple farm food. These natural foods helped people stay healthier, especially during tough seasons. The act of foraging also connected people to the land. They noticed when the first berries ripened or when the wild garlic popped through the soil. They learned to move with the seasons, to respect what nature offered, and to take only what they needed. Sometimes, too much foraging could cause trouble. If a whole village picked all the berries in one area, the plants would not grow well the next year. So, people learned to take a little and leave the rest. This balance helped nature, and people lived together for a long time. Foraging was often a quiet, peaceful part of the day, a break from hard farm work. It was also a time when people could talk, sing, or enjoy nature. Some even made it a small celebration, especially during berry season or honey gathering. Today, most of us have lost the skill of finding food in the wild. We walk past edible plants without knowing, but in medieval times, this knowledge was as important as knowing how to cook or sew. Without it, a family could starve. Nature was not just something people looked at. It was their pantry, their medicine cabinet, and sometimes even their last hope. Learning what to gather, when to gather it, and how to use it was one of the most important survival skills in the medieval world. In the end, wild food helped fill the gaps left by farming. It brought color, variety, and health to meals. And for many people, it meant the difference between hunger and a full belly. In medieval Europe, what you ate often depended on who you were. There was a big difference between the meals of rich people and poor people. While peasants struggled to grow and gather enough food, the wealthy enjoyed large feasts with dishes that many people could not even dream of tasting. For most poor families, daily meals were simple. They ate grains like barley, rye, and oats. These were cooked into porridge or baked into heavy, dark bread. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, and turnips were common. Sometimes they had beans or peas. Meat was rare, and dairy products like cheese or butter were saved for special days. Meals were filling, but plain. There were few spices, and cooking methods were limited. Most food was boiled or baked. Salt was used for flavor and for keeping food from spoiling. Herbs from the garden or nearby fields were added for taste and health. But most meals were about survival, not enjoyment. Now compare this to the lives of nobles, knights, and lords. These people lived in large homes or castles. They had servants to cook and prepare food. Their meals were rich in flavor, full of variety, and often served in many courses. The rich had access to white bread made from fine wheat flour. This bread was soft and light, very different from the dense loaves eaten by peasants. They ate meats like beef, pork, venison, and even exotic birds like swans and peacocks. These meats were roasted, grilled, and spiced with herbs brought from faraway lands. Spices were one of the biggest signs of wealth. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg came from Asia and were very expensive. These spices added flavor and showed off status. A dish with many spices told guests that the host was rich and powerful. The wealthy also enjoyed sugar, which was rare and costly. It came in blocks and had to be shaved down. Sugar was used to sweeten fruits or to make special desserts. Meanwhile, peasants used honey when they could find it, and usually only for special events. Feasts in noble houses were grand events. Long tables were filled with dishes, and people ate for hours. Servants brought out one course after another. There might be pies filled with meat, fish decorated with herbs, and large cakes or tarts for dessert. These feasts were not just about food. They were also about showing power and wealth. Drinks were different too. While peasants drank weak beer or ale every day, nobles drank fine wine or stronger ale. Wine was imported or made from grapes, grown on their own land. It was kept in barrels or glass bottles and served in metal or ceramic cups. Even the way people ate was different. Poor families shared simple bowls and spoons. They ate close to the fire, sitting on benches or the floor. Rich people ate from plates made of silver or pewter. They used fine knives and had servants to wash their hands between courses. The gap in food was not just about taste. It also affected health. Rich people often ate too much and had problems like gout, a painful disease caused by eating too much meat and rich food. On the other hand, poor people often did not get enough to eat and suffered from hunger and weakness. However, rich people had their own worries. They were always afraid of poison. It was common for nobles to have someone taste their food first, just in case someone tried to kill them. Peasants did not have this problem But they had to worry about bad harvests and food shortages. Holidays showed the gap even more. For the poor, a holiday might mean getting a piece of meat or sweet bread. For the rich, it meant huge meals, special desserts, and music during dinner. While the poor hoped to eat well on 1 or 2 days, the rich often ate like that all year. The church also played a role in food. There were many days when people were told not to eat meat. Poor people already ate mostly plants and grains, so this was not a big change for them. But the rich had to switch from fancy meats to fish or other dishes. They made sure their meals were still impressive, even without meat. Some rich families had their own gardens and even farms, but they did not work the land themselves. They paid peasants to grow food for them, so even the food on the noble S table was often made possible by the hard work of poor people. There were also middle-class people, like merchants and skilled workers in towns. These people had more variety than peasants, but not as much as nobles. They might eat meat once a week, enjoy cheese and eggs more often, and buy a few imported goods, like dried fruit or wine. In cities, markets sold fresh food, bread, meat, and fish. The rich sent servants to buy the best items early in the morning. The poor came later and took what was left. Sometimes they bought scraps or bones to make soup. In many towns, the difference between rich and poor could be seen just by looking into someone's basket. In hard times, like during a famine, the rich could often buy food from other areas. The poor had no such option. They went hungry, and many died when food ran out. This was one of the cruelest effects of the food gap. Still, not all nobles were selfish. Some gave food to the poor during bad years. Some monasteries and churches offered bread or soup to those in need. These acts of kindness helped, but they could not close the gap between rich and poor meals. In the end, your place in society decided what went on your plate. If you were born into a noble family, you had a full table. If you were born a peasant, you had to work every day to make sure your family had enough to eat. The food gap in medieval times was not just about taste. It was about power, money, and survival. Life in medieval times was often a struggle, and one of the biggest fears was hunger. Food was not always easy to come by. Crops could fail, animals could die, winters could be long and cold. When things went wrong, people suffered. Famines were a real part of life, and they came often. A famine did not need to be massive to be deadly. Sometimes all it took was 1 or 2 bad harvests. If too much rain came during planting season, seeds would rot. If there was no rain, crops would dry up. A sudden frost could destroy plants before they were ready. Insects could eat the crops before humans had the chance. Poor families had no extra food stored. They lived day by day, season by season. When the fields failed, there was nothing to fall back on. There were no government programs, no food banks, and no supermarkets to fill the gap. People were on their own, and that was a scary place to be. When food became scarce, prices rose. In towns and villages, bread cost more. Those who had money could still buy what they needed, but poor people could not. Some were forced to sell their animals, their tools, or even their land to buy food. Others had nothing left to sell. People ate less and worked harder. Hunger made them weak, but they still had to farm, fetch water, and care for children. Many could not keep up. Illness followed hunger. When the body does not get enough food, it cannot fight off sickness. Colds turned into deadly fevers. Small wounds became big infections. In times of famine, people ate things they would never eat in normal times. Bark was peeled from trees and boiled. Grass and weeds were picked and made into soups. Leather belts and shoes were softened and chewed. Some even ate dirt or clay, hoping it would fill their stomachs for a little while. In the worst times, people were said to eat rats, dogs, or animals they would normally avoid. There are even dark stories in history of people turning on one another out of pure desperation. These were not common, but they show how bad things could get when hunger took over. Children and the elderly were the first to suffer. Their bodies were weaker, and they could not go long without food. Many families lost the youngest members during famines. It was a pain that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Villages grew quiet during hunger. Festivals were canceled. Markets had little to sell. People stayed home, hoping to save their strength. Families moved in with others to share food and firewood. Sometimes entire villages left their homes, hoping to find food in another town or region. The church tried to help. Monasteries often had food stores and gave bread or soup to the hungry. But even these stores could run out. Priests told people to pray, fast, and help one another. Sometimes they held special days of prayer, asking God to bring rain or end a long winter. Local lords had a duty to protect their people, but not all of them cared. Some gave grain from their stores, others did nothing, or even raised rents to make more money. In these times, trust between the rich and poor could break down quickly. Famines often led to other problems. People left their homes, which made towns more crowded. Crime increased as hungry people stole food or money. Farmers could not plant if they were too weak. This made it even harder to recover the next year. There were also years when famine followed disease. For example, after the Black Death, many fields were empty because people had died. This led to more hunger. In other cases, hunger made people weak, and disease spread faster. People did what they could to survive. They planted fast-growing crops like turnips or beans. They dried everything they could during good years. They worked together to help neighbors. But sometimes, even that was not enough. Food shortages taught people to be clever. They learned how to make meals from almost nothing. They boiled bones, dried weeds, and reused every part of a plant. They baked bread with ground-up tree bark or old acorns when grain ran out. These were not tasty meals, but they kept people alive. Songs, stories, and sayings from that time often spoke about hunger. People remembered the hard years and passed those memories down. These stories helped teach younger generations to be careful, to save, and to always be prepared. Some towns made laws to protect food during bad times. Bakers could be punished for making small loaves. Traders were watched closely to stop them from raising prices too high. But these laws did not always help the poorest people. During a famine, daily life changed. People who once shared food now kept it hidden. Trust became hard. Fear grew. And even when the hunger ended, the damage was deep. Bodies were weaker, farms needed time to recover, and many families were broken. But people kept going. They had to. They rebuilt their lives, planted again, and hoped for better weather. Hunger was a teacher, a cruel one, but it made people strong in ways they did not always see. Today, many of us have more food than we need. We throw away leftovers or forget what is in the fridge. But for people in the medieval world, hunger was never far away. It was a shadow that followed every season. It shaped how they lived, how they ate, and how they saw the world. Understanding that hunger helps us see how lucky we are today. It also reminds us that food is not something to waste. For medieval people, every crumb mattered. Every bite was a step toward survival. In the medieval world, children learned about food from the moment they could walk. Food was not just something served to them, it was something they helped grow, gather, cook, and protect. From a young age, they became part of the daily work needed to keep their family fed. There were no schools teaching nutrition or health. The kitchen and the field were the classrooms. Parents, grandparents, and older siblings were the teachers. And the lessons were serious. If you did not learn, you might not survive. One of the first jobs children had was helping in the garden. They learned how to plant seeds, pull weeds, and water vegetables. They watched the plants grow day by day. This taught them patience and respect for the land. They knew where food came from because they helped bring it out of the ground with their own hands. Children also helped with foraging. They picked berries, nuts, and herbs. They learned which plants were safe and which ones were dangerous. They listened to stories about how their parents had learned these same things. These stories were more than tales. They were warnings, guides, and tools for survival. In some families, children helped with fishing. They learned how to make simple hooks and nets. They sat by the river and waited quietly, learning to watch the water and understand where the fish might be. If they caught something, it was a proud moment. It meant the family would eat better that night. Inside the home, children helped with preparing food. They gathered firewood, filled water jugs, and stirred pots. They learned to make simple meals, like porridge or stew. They crushed herbs with stones and helped shape dough for bread. These small jobs helped them feel useful and taught them skills they would need all their lives. Even the task of watching food cook was important. They learned how to tell when something was done, by sight, smell, or sound. There were no timers or thermometers. A good cook needed to pay attention. Children watched carefully so they could remember everything. Boys and girls both had roles, though these could vary. Girls often spent more time in the kitchen, while boys helped more in the fields. But when it came to food, everyone worked together. Survival did not care about gender. What mattered was that everyone knew what to do. Children also learned not to waste anything. If they left food on their plate, it might be the only meal that day. They were taught to eat every bite, save scraps, and reuse what they could. This was not just a rule. It was a way of life. They learned how to store food too. They helped hang herbs to dry, pack grains in bags, and place vegetables in cool cellars. They saw how food could spoil if it was not handled properly. These lessons were part of everyday life, not special training. Food was also part of their games and play. Children pretended to cook with leaves, mud, and sticks. They made small meals for their dolls or animals. These games helped them practice the tasks they would do for real as they grew older. When there was a feast or special event, children helped carry food, set up tables, and clean up after. They felt proud to be part of something bigger. These events were not only fun, but also showed them how food brought the community together. Children also saw the hard side of food. They noticed when there was not enough to go around. They felt the hunger in their own bellies and saw it in their parents tired faces. They learned that sometimes even hard work was not enough to stop the pain of an empty table. This made them grow up fast. They became careful, thoughtful, and aware. A child who could cook a simple meal, collect wild greens, or dry herbs was a gift to the family. Their work was not just helpful, it could be the difference between hunger and health. As they got older, children were trusted with more. They helped plant bigger fields, watch over animals, or carry goods to market. They learned how to trade, how to deal with neighbors, and how to tell if a piece of bread was fresh or spoiled. Food also taught them values. They learned about sharing when they gave part of their meal to a sibling. They learned about respect when they waited for the elders to eat first. They learned about gratitude when they thanked their parents or said a short prayer before eating. In some homes, older children helped care for the younger ones, making sure they were fed and clean. This taught them kindness, responsibility, and leadership. These lessons would stay with them for life. Children who lived near castles or noble houses saw different kinds of food. They might work as kitchen helpers or messengers. There, they learned about spices, meats, and breads they would not see at home. This could open their eyes to new things, but also remind them of their own humble meals. But no matter where they lived, all medieval children learned that food was work. It was not easy to get, and it never came for free. Every bite was earned through effort, care, and knowledge. In modern times, children might not know where their food comes from. They might throw away half-eaten sandwiches or ignore vegetables on their plate. But in the medieval world, children knew every step of the food journey, from soil to table. This deep connection made them stronger. It gave them pride and skill. It also helped them understand the world around them. They were not just kids. They were future farmers, cooks, and foragers. And the lessons they learned through food helped them grow into capable, caring adults. Today, cooking is often done with the push of a button. We have ovens, stoves, microwaves, and electric kettles. We use timers and digital tools to help us. But in medieval times, cooking was done without any of these things. Making a meal took time, patience, and creativity. It was not just a task. It was a skill people learned over years. Most people, especially peasants, did not have kitchens like we do today. Their homes were small, often with only 1 or 2 rooms. The fire was the heart of the house. It gave heat, light, and a place to cook. A single fire had to do everything. There were no gas stoves or ovens with dials. People cooked over an open flame or on hot coals. A large iron or clay pot would hang from a hook or sit on a tripod above the fire. This pot was used for nearly every meal. Stews, porridge, and soups were common because they could be left to cook slowly and feed many people. Since firewood was valuable, people tried to cook everything in one pot. This saved time and fuel. Meals were often planned around what could go into that pot: grains, beans, vegetables, and sometimes a bit of meat all went in together. These dishes were filling and warm, perfect for long workdays and cold evenings. Bread was a big part of the diet, but baking it at home was not always possible. Most peasant homes did not have ovens. Instead, villages often had a communal oven, which everyone used. Families took turns baking their loaves. Bread was made in large batches to last several days. It was dense, dark, and heavy, not like the soft bread we know today. In wealthier homes, cooking looked very different. Castles and large houses had bigger fireplaces, special cooking tools, and even ovens. They had separate rooms for preparing food, storing ingredients, and washing dishes. Servants or cooks did most of the work. The meals were more complex, with roasting, baking, and frying all done in separate steps. But for most people, cooking was a simple and direct process. There were only a few tools: a pot, a pan, a knife, a spoon, and maybe a flat stone or a wooden board. Plates were sometimes made of wood, clay, or even stale bread, which soaked up juices from the food. Knives were used for cutting and eating, and each person usually had their own. Spoons were shared, especially by children. Forks were rare in most parts of Europe and did not become common until much later. People cooked with whatever was available. Recipes were not written down in most homes. Cooking was taught by watching and doing. A mother showed her daughter how much water to use, or when the soup smelled ready. These lessons were passed from one generation to the next. Flavors were simple, but smart. People used herbs like parsley, thyme, garlic, and mint to add taste. Salt was used to preserve and flavor. In some areas, they used vinegar or sour milk to add a sharp taste to food. When they had access to onions or leeks, they added them to everything. Roasting meat was rare for the poor, but when it happened, it was done over a spit or on a flat stone near the fire. The meat had to be turned often to cook evenly. This took a long time and required attention, which is why it was mostly done during feasts or special events. Cooking in the summer was different from winter. In warmer months, people used outdoor spaces to cook. This helped keep the house cool and safe. In winter, everything was done inside near the fire. The smoke made the room dark and sometimes hard to breathe, but there was no other choice. There were also risks. Fires could get out of control. Clothes could catch on fire. Children had to be careful. Cooking was not just work. It could also be dangerous. Meals were often eaten as soon as they were cooked. There were no fridges or freezers. Leftovers had to be eaten quickly or stored in a cool place. People knew how to stretch meals, adding water to soup or making bread into porridge. Every crumb was used. Cooking took hours, not minutes. There was no rushing. Food had to be prepared, watched, stirred, and tasted. This slow process gave people time to talk, sing, or share stories while they worked. It was part of the rhythm of the day. Cleanup was done with water from wells or rivers. Soap was made from ash and animal fat. Dishes were scrubbed with sand or cloths. Clean water was precious, so people used as little as possible and reused it when they could. Despite the hard work, people found joy in cooking. A pot bubbling over the fire, the smell of bread baking, or the taste of fresh herbs brought comfort. Cooking connected people to their food, their land, and each other. In today's world, cooking can feel like a chore, but in medieval times, it was a necessary part of life. It showed skill, love, and care. Every meal told a story of the season, the harvest, and the hands that made it. Cooking without kitchens was not easy, but it was full of meaning. It reminded people every day that food did not just appear. It was earned, prepared with care, and shared with others. Today, food is easier to get than ever before. We can go to the store and buy strawberries in winter, chicken from another country, and meals that are ready in 5 minutes. But even with all this comfort, many people feel disconnected from their food. We forget where it comes from, how it is made, and how lucky we are to have it. Looking back at how people ate in medieval times can teach us some important lessons. The first lesson is respect for food. Medieval people could not afford to waste anything. Every crumb mattered. If they dropped bread on the ground, they picked it up. If they had old vegetables, they turned them into soup. Bones were boiled for broth, and even peels were used to feed animals. Nothing was thrown away. Today, we throw away food every day without thinking twice. We can learn to waste less and be more grateful. The second lesson is about eating with the seasons. Medieval people ate what was in season. They had no choice. They waited for the right time of year for apples, berries, or fresh greens. When the season ended, the food was gone. This rhythm helped the land rest and recover. It also gave people a better connection to nature. Today, we can eat anything at any time, but that comes at a cost. Foods are flown from far away, which uses fuel and adds pollution. Eating local and seasonal foods helps the planet and can be better for our health. Another lesson is about food knowledge. In medieval times, people knew what was in their food. They knew how to grow it, how to cook it, and how to store it. Children learned these skills from a young age. They understood what plants were safe, how to use herbs, and how to tell if food was bad. Today, many people do not know how to cook a basic meal without help from a package. Learning how to cook from scratch, how to garden, and how to store food can give us more control over our lives. Medieval eating also reminds us of the power of community. People shared food, worked together to store it, and helped each other in hard times. There were no food delivery apps. If someone was hungry, neighbors helped. If someone had extra, they shared. Food was more than fuel. It was a way to connect, to care, and to survive together. Today, some of that community spirit is lost, but we can bring it back by cooking together, eating as a family, or even growing food with others. There is also a lesson about patience. Medieval food took time. People waited for bread to rise, stews to simmer, and fruits to dry in the sun. There was no rushing. Meals were made with care and effort. Today, fast food is everywhere. But quick does not always mean better. When we slow down, we enjoy our food more. We also appreciate the people who made it, whether it was a farmer, a baker, or someone in our family. We can also learn from the way medieval people handled hard times. They knew how to survive without much. When crops failed, they adapted. They used wild plants, dried herbs, and old recipes. They made simple food that kept them going. This kind of strength and creativity can help us today, especially in times of crisis or change. Knowing how to make meals with little can be a powerful skill. Even though medieval life was hard, there was something real about it. People were closer to their food. They could see it grow, smell it cooking, and taste the work in every bite. Today, much of that is hidden behind packaging and plastic. We can bring some of that closeness back by cooking at home, visiting local farms, or even planting a few herbs on the windowsill. Modern technology gives us many gifts. We can store food safely, ship it quickly, and feed more people than ever before. But we should not forget the wisdom of the past. Medieval people knew how to live with the land. They were careful, smart, and deeply aware of the value of every meal. Sometimes we think that more choice means better living, but too much choice can make us forget what really matters. A simple bowl of soup shared with family can bring more joy than the fanciest dish. A piece of bread you baked yourself can taste better than anything from the store. So, what can we take from medieval eating? We can learn to respect food. We can cook more and waste less. We can eat with the seasons and connect with the land. We can share meals and build stronger communities. And most of all, we can remember that food is not just something we buy. It is something that connects us to each other, to our past, and to the world around us. As we move forward, let us not forget the lessons of the past. The people who lived before supermarkets had to work hard for every bite, but they also knew something many of us have forgotten, that food is life and every meal is a gift.